The departure board at JFK Airport flickered with the word delayed in harsh red letters next to Flight 447. Passengers clustered around Gate 22, some checking their watches, others pacing with phones pressed to their ears. The gate agent's voice crackled through the intercom for the third time in an hour. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the continued delay. We're experiencing technical difficulties with our navigation system's calibration. We'll begin boarding as soon as possible. Thank you for your patience. A collective groan rippled through the crowd. A businessman in an expensive suit muttered something about misconnections. A mother bounced a fussy toddler on her hip, exhaustion etched across her face. Near the windows, a teenage boy with headphones around his neck stared out at the massive aircraft sitting on the tarmac, rain beginning to streak the glass. Among the frustrated passengers stood Elias Turner, a black man in his mid-30s wearing a faded red t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He carried only a small canvas duffel bag, the strap worn smooth from years of use. While others complained or scrolled through their phones with agitated swipes, Elias simply stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes distant. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than a long day of travel. When boarding finally began, first-class passengers were called first. A white woman in her late 20s rushed forward, designer carry-on in one hand, phone in the other. Olivia Whitaker moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to priority treatment. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her outfit carefully curated for what she'd later describe as airport casual on her social media. She barely glanced at the gate agent as she scanned her boarding pass. "Ms. Whitaker," the agent's voice stopped her. "I'm sorry, but there's been a last-minute change. Your first-class seat has been reassigned due to an upgrade error in our system. You've been moved to economy, seat 3B. Olivia's perfectly glossed lips parted in disbelief. "Excuse me? I paid for first class. I have a meeting as soon as I land, and I need the space to work. I understand your frustration, ma'am. We're offering a full refund of the fare difference and a travel voucher for your inconvenience." "A voucher?" Olivia's voice rose slightly. "I don't need a voucher. I need the seat I paid for." The gate agent maintained her professional smile, but her eyes showed the weariness of someone who dealt with too many complaints today. "Unfortunately, all first-class seats are now occupied. I can put you on the next available flight tomorrow with a confirmed first-class seat." Olivia glanced at her phone, where messages from her fiancé were already piling up about the sponsorship meeting she couldn't miss. She let out a sharp breath. "Fine. Economy. 3B. She boarded the plane with her jaw clenched, the voucher crumpled in her hand. As she made her way down the aisle, she couldn't help but notice the passengers in first class, some already sipping champagne, stretched out in seats that should have been hers. When she reached row 3, she stopped short. The man in seat 3C, the window seat next to hers, was already asleep. His head rested against the window, one arm protectively wrapped around the duffel bag on his lap. Olivia recognized the worn red t-shirt from the gate. She'd barely noticed him then. Now he was her seatmate. She shoved her carry-on into the overhead compartment with more force than necessary, then squeezed past the sleeping man to reach her middle seat. As she settled in, she pulled out her phone and began typing furiously to her fiancé. "You won't believe this. Downgraded to economy. Sitting next to some guy who's already passed out. This day cannot get worse." Across the aisle in seat 3D, 16-year-old Liam Bradford clutched his phone, his eyes fixed on the man in 3C. He'd noticed him at the gate, but he'd thought his eyes were playing tricks. Now, sitting just feet away, he was almost certain. The profile, the scars on a man's hands visible even in sleep, the way he held himself even while unconscious. Liam's fingers hovered over his phone screen, torn between excitement and doubt. Should he say something? Ask for confirmation? He'd followed military aviation accounts for years, studied every pilot who'd made a difference. If this was really him, but the man looked so tired, so deliberately disconnected from the world around him. Liam decided to wait. Further back in the economy section, flight attendant Marisol Chin moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, helping passengers stow bags and find their seats. She was in her 40s, with kind eyes that had seen enough of humanity at 30,000 feet to surprise her anymore. Or so she thought. When she reached row 3 to check seatbelts before departure, her gaze landed on the sleeping man in 3C. Something about him made her pause. The way his fingers gripped the duffel bag, even in sleep. The faint scars on his hands. The set of his shoulders, protective and alert despite his closed eyes. She'd worked military charter flights years ago, back when she was younger, and she'd learned to recognize that particular type of exhaustion. The kind that came from carrying weight no civilian could understand. She studied his face for a moment longer, a memory tugging at the edge of her mind, before moving on. Whatever she thought she recognized, it wasn't her business. Not yet. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, the sounds of boarding passengers washing over him like white noise. He learned long ago how to sleep anywhere, under any conditions. But it wasn't rest, not really. It was more like shutting down, powering off the parts of himself that remembered too much. In his arms, the duffel bag felt heavier than it should. Inside were the only things that mattered anymore. A worn teddy bear with one missing eye. A set of pilot wings, the metal tarnished with age. Pieces of a life he'd walked away from. The intercom crackled to life, and a deep, authoritative voice filled the cabin. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Raymond Cole speaking. I apologize for our delay this evening. We've completed our systems check and will be departing shortly. Flight time to our destination will be approximately 6 hours. We're expecting some weather along the way, but nothing we can't handle. Sit back, relax, and we'll have you on the ground safely before you know it." The captain's voice faded, and Elias's grip on the armrest tightened slightly. His eyes remained closed. Before departure, Captain Cole did something he rarely did. He left the cockpit and walked through the cabin, his silver hair and pilot's uniform commanding respect from passengers who glanced up as he passed. He was in his late 50s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in the sky. His eyes swept over the passengers with the automatic assessment of someone trained to notice details. When he reached row 3, his gaze landed on Elias, and for just a fraction of a second, his expression changed. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something more complex. Surprise? Guilt? He stopped walking, his hand gripping the back of seat 2C as he stared at the sleeping man. Then he caught himself. His jaw tightened, and he continued down the aisle without a word, without a greeting, as if he'd seen nothing at all. In first class, Andrew Novak made sure everyone within earshot knew exactly how displeased he was with the delay. The tech CEO, wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than most passengers' monthly rent, spoke loudly into his phone about lost time and incompetent airlines. His assistant, Caroline, sat beside him, tapping notes into her tablet with an expression that revealed nothing. She'd been with him for 3 years, long enough to know that his public persona and his private character were two very different things. Long enough to start documenting the difference. "This is ridiculous," Novak announced to no one in particular. "I could fly this plane myself. I've logged hundreds of hours in helicopters." Caroline's fingers moved across her screen, recording the comment with a timestamp. She'd learned to be patient, to collect evidence, to wait for the right moment. Outside, thunder rumbled across the sky, and rain began hammering against the aircraft's metal skin. The lights in the cabin flickered once, then steadied. Passengers shifted nervously. A woman near the back whispered a prayer. Olivia's hands gripped her armrests, her knuckles white. Beside her, Elias didn't stir. His breathing remained slow and even, as if the storm outside was nothing more than distant music. Olivia found herself staring at him, wondering how anyone could be so calm. She noticed the scars on his hands more clearly now, thin white lines that spoke of old injuries. There was something about him that didn't fit the image of a regular passenger. Something that made her curious despite her irritation. Liam finally worked up the courage to lean across the aisle. "Excuse me," he whispered to Olivia. "Do you know who that is?" Olivia glanced at Elias, then back at the teenager. "Some tired guy who got on the plane before me." "What?" "I think." Liam hesitated. "I think he might be someone important." "Important?" Olivia looked at Elias again, taking in the worn t-shirt, the old duffel bag, the complete absence of anything that screamed success or status. He looks like he just rolled out of bed. Liam's face fell. Never mind. But the seed was planted. Olivia found herself studying Elias more closely, trying to see whatever this kid saw. She noticed the way he held himself, even in sleep. The unconscious discipline in his posture. The protective grip on that duffel bag. Who are you? She thought. The intercom crackled again. Flight attendants, prepare for departure. Marisol moved through the cabin one final time, checking that everyone was buckled in. When she reached row 3, she paused again beside Elias. Something in her wanted to wake him, to ask the question forming in her mind. But she didn't. Instead, she simply adjusted the air vent above his seat and moved on. The engines began to roar, that deep, powerful sound that always made nervous flyers grip their armrests tighter. Olivia closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe steadily. She hated flying, hated the loss of control, the forced trust in machinery and strangers. Beside her, Elias's hand moved to the armrest between them. His fingers curled around it, gripping tight, and for the first time since boarding, his eyes opened. Just a crack, just enough to see the runway lights beginning to blur past the window. His expression wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. Anticipation mixed with something darker. Something haunted. The plane lifted off the ground, climbing into the storm-dark sky, and Elias's lips moved in what might have been a prayer or a promise. The words were too quiet for anyone to hear, lost in the roar of ascent. But Olivia saw his face in that moment, saw the weight he carried in his eyes, and she realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that she'd made assumptions about him based on nothing but appearance and circumstance. She looked away, suddenly ashamed, and pulled out her phone to distract herself. But the image of his expression stayed with her as they climbed higher into the turbulent sky. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Around the cabin, passengers began to relax, pulling out laptops and books, accepting drinks from the flight attendants. The storm they climbed through had given way to clearer air, though occasional turbulence still rattled the wings. Elias opened his eyes fully for the first time since takeoff. He straightened slightly in his seat, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness, and stared out the window at the darkening sky. Clouds stretched endlessly below them, painted orange and purple by the setting sun. Olivia had been watching him from the corner of her eye. Now that he was awake, she felt awkward about the silence between them. She was someone who made her living through connection, through carefully curated conversation and strategic relationships. Sitting in uncomfortable silence next to a stranger felt wrong. So, she said, keeping her tone light and casual, long day. Elias turned his head slightly, acknowledging her with a small nod. You could say that. Business or pleasure? She tried to smile, the same one she used in her brand partnership meetings. Neither. His answer was polite but firm. A door closing softly but definitively. Olivia wasn't used to being shut down so quickly. She shifted in her seat, trying a different approach. I'm Olivia. I'm a social media strategist. I work with brands to build their online presence. That's nice. Elias's tone was neutral, neither interested nor dismissive. What do you do? She knew she was pushing, but something about his evasiveness made her more curious. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the window. I used to fly. Not anymore. Oh, Olivia perked up. You were a pilot? Commercial or private? The corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. Something like that. So why'd you get up? The question came out more blunt than she'd intended, and she immediately regretted her tone. Elias turned to look at her fully for the first time. His eyes were dark and impossibly tired, with depths she couldn't begin to understand. Some flights stay with you, he said quietly. Then he closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the seat, clearly ending the conversation. Olivia sat there, stung by the dismissal, but intrigued by the cryptic response. Some flights stay with you. What did that mean? What kind of pilot talked like that? Across the aisle, Liam had heard every word. His certainty grew with each exchange. The way Elias spoke, the careful evasion, the weight in his voice when he mentioned flying. Liam leaned toward Caroline, who sat in the aisle seat one row up, and whispered urgently, "That's Elias Turner. I'm sure of it." Caroline glanced back at the sleeping man, her expression thoughtful. She pulled out her phone and typed the name in her notes app. Turner. She added a question mark, then a note about the teenager's conviction. Information was currency in her world, and she'd learned to collect it everywhere she went. "Why would someone famous fly economy?" she murmured, more to herself than to Liam. "Maybe he doesn't want to be recognized," Liam suggested. "Maybe he's trying to disappear." Caroline studied Elias for another moment, then returned to her tablet. But she didn't delete the note. 20 minutes later, Elias jolted awake with a sharp intake of breath. His hand shot out, grabbing the duffel bag, so hard his knuckles went white. "I can't lose them again," he muttered, his voice rough with sleep and panic. His eyes were unfocused, still seeing whatever nightmare had gripped him. Olivia jumped at the sudden movement. "Hey, are you okay?" Elias blinked rapidly, reality slowly filtering back in. He looked down at his hands, at the way he was clutching the bag, and forced himself to relax his grip. "Sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bad dream." But Olivia had seen his face in that unguarded moment, had heard the anguish in those 5 words. "I can't lose them again." Whoever this man was, whatever he'd been through, it had carved itself deep into his soul. "Do you want some water?" she asked, her voice softer now. "I can call the flight attendant." "I'm Phoenix." But he didn't sound fine. He sounded like someone holding himself together through sheer force of will. Before Olivia could respond, Marisol appeared beside their row with a drink cart. Her eyes went straight to Elias, and something in her expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine concern. "Sir, can I get you anything?" The way she said "sir" carried a weight that made Olivia's eyebrows rise. It wasn't the casual courtesy flight attendants used with every passenger. It was respect, the kind earned, not given. "Just water, please," Elias said. Marisol handed him a bottle, her gaze lingering on his face. "If you need anything at all, please let me know." "Thank you." Elias's response was quiet, but carried its own note of recognition, as if he understood the subtext of her offer. After Marisol moved on, Olivia couldn't help herself. "Why does she treat you like that?" "Like what?" "Like you're someone important." Elias took a long drink of water before answering. "Maybe she's just good at her job." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." He met her eyes, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. "I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to get from one place to another without complications." "Fair enough." Olivia settled back in her seat, but her mind was spinning. The teenager across the aisle thought he was important. The flight attendant treated him with unusual respect. And those scars on his hands, the nightmares, the cryptic comments about flying, it all added up to something she couldn't quite solve. Up in first class, Andrew Novak's voice carried down the cabin as he held court with the passengers around him. "I've logged over 300 hours in helicopters," he announced loudly. "Mostly for recreational flying, but I've handled some pretty challenging conditions. Mountains, coastal winds, you name it." Elias, despite himself, glanced toward the front of the plane. His expression flickered with something that might have been amusement or disdain, but it was gone so quickly Olivia almost missed it. "You know him?" she asked. "No." The single word was clipped. Final. But Olivia had seen his reaction. Whatever Novak was claiming, Elias clearly didn't think much of it. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and the seatbelt sign dinged back on. The cabin shuddered, and somewhere behind them, a baby started crying. The sound cut through the ambient noise, high and distressed. Elias's hand immediately went to his duffel bag. He unzipped it just slightly, and Olivia caught a glimpse of something inside. Worn brown fur, a teddy bear's ear, and beneath it, metal that gleamed dully in the cabin light. Wings. Pilot wings, old and tarnished. Her breath caught. Before she could process what she'd seen, Elias zipped the bag shut again and held it close to his chest. His face had softened in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. The hardness he usually wore like armor had cracked, just for a moment. Is that? Olivia started, then stopped. It felt like prying into something sacred. It belonged to someone I cared about, Elias said quietly. He didn't elaborate, and Olivia didn't push. But she understood, in that moment, that whatever he carried in that bag, it wasn't just objects. It was memory. It was grief. Her phone buzzed with a message from her fiancé. Don't forget the sponsorship meeting. Appearance matters. Make sure you look refreshed, not tired. Olivia stared at the words, feeling something twist in her chest. Appearance matters. That had been her mantra for so long. The perfect outfit, the perfect angle, the perfect caption. Everything curated, nothing real. She looked at Elias, holding his battered duffel bag with its simple, painful contents. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. Wasn't performing for invisible audiences. He was just existing with his grief and his memories, honest in a way that made her entire career feel hollow. She turned her phone face down and didn't respond to the message. The turbulence worsened. The plane shook hard enough to rattle the overhead compartments, and nervous murmurs rippled through the cabin. A drink cart somewhere behind them crashed against a seat with a metallic clang. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. But the shaking continued, relentless and unforgiving. Olivia's breathing quickened, her hands gripping the armrests so hard her fingernails dug into the fabric. She hated this, hated the feeling of helplessness, the reminder that she was trapped in a metal tube miles above the earth with no control over anything. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she could feel sweat beginning to bead at her temples despite the cabin's cool air. Around her, other passengers were reacting with varying degrees of alarm. A woman 2 rows back was praying audibly in Spanish. A businessman across the aisle had gone pale, his laptop forgotten on his tray table. Even the flight attendants had taken their seats, their practice calm slipping just slightly. "Hey," Elias's voice cut through her rising panic, steady and firm. "Look at me." She turned her head, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark and focused, completely unshaken by the turbulence that had the rest of the cabin on edge. "Breathe with me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "In for 4 counts. Hold for 2. Out for 6. Can you do that?" "Why 6? Her voice was tight with anxiety, barely controlled. "Because the exhale is where you find the calm. The longer you breathe out, the more your body understands there's no immediate threat. It's biology. Trust me." Something in his voice, in the absolute certainty of his tone, made her believe him. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "Good. Now watch me first." He demonstrated, his chest rising slowly as he counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. He held the breath for a beat, then released it in a controlled stream. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Olivia followed his lead, breathing in as he counted quietly beside her, holding, then releasing slowly. The first attempt was shaky, her exhale coming out in stuttered bursts. But Elias didn't judge. He just started the count again, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "You're doing fine," he said between breaths. "Just focus on the count. Nothing else matters right now except the count." The turbulence continued, the plane dropping suddenly and causing gasps throughout the cabin. But Olivia kept breathing with Elias, following his rhythm. Gradually, impossibly, her panic began to ease. Her heart rate slowed. The metallic taste of fear in her mouth faded. The world stopped tilting quite so violently, or at least her perception of it did. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, the turbulence began to subside. The plane's shaking gentled to occasional bumps. The seatbelt sign remained on, but the immediate crisis had passed. "Better?" Elias asked, his voice returning to its normal quiet tone. Olivia nodded, surprised at how much the simple technique had helped. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but the overwhelming panic had receded. "Where'd you learn that?" "Training." He didn't specify what kind, but she could guess now. When things get rough up there, panic kills you faster than the actual danger. You have to stay calm. Think clearly. Make decisions based on logic, not fear. Is that what you did when you flew? Every time, his expression grew distant, his gaze drifting past her to the window. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The weight in those last 4 words told her everything about the times it hadn't worked. About the flights that stayed with you, haunting you long after you'd landed. The turbulence eased, and the seatbelt sign turned off. But Olivia didn't let go of the armrest immediately. She sat there, breathing steadily, aware that this stranger had just helped her in a way no one else on the plane could have. "Thank you," she said, and meant it genuinely for the first time since they'd met. "You're welcome." At that moment, Captain Cole emerged from the cockpit again. It was unusual for a captain to walk through the cabin during flight, especially during turbulence, but he moved with purpose down the aisle. His eyes scanned the passengers, but Olivia noticed the way his gaze kept returning to their row. To Elias. When he reached row 3, he stopped. He stood there for several seconds, looking down at Elias with an expression Olivia couldn't quite read. It was intense, laden with history. Recognition mixed with something darker. Elias felt the stare and looked up. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. Olivia felt like she was witnessing something private, something significant. Then Captain Cole nodded slightly, just once, and continued toward the back of the plane. Elias's jaw clenched. His hands, which had been relaxed moments before, tightened into fists. Across the aisle, Liam had seen the entire exchange. His eyes went wide with excitement. He pulled out his phone and began typing frantically, pulling up saved images and articles. After a few moments, he found what he was looking for. A photo from a military ceremony several years old. A younger Elias Turner, standing at attention, receiving medals from a high-ranking officer. And behind him in that photo, barely visible in the background, was Captain Raymond Cole. Liam's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. They knew each other. They'd served together. And from the tension in that brief moment, whatever history they shared, it wasn't simple. He looked up, catching Olivia's eye. She saw the excitement in his face, the certainty. And she saw him mouth 2 words that changed everything she thought she knew about the man sitting beside her. Elias Turner. Olivia's breath stopped. She knew that name. Everyone who'd paid any attention to military aviation in the past decade knew that name. The pilot who'd done the impossible. The hero who'd disappeared. The man who'd walked away from everything. And he was sitting in seat 3C, holding a teddy bear and trying to disappear into himself. She looked at Elias with new eyes, seeing not just a tired man in a worn t-shirt, but someone carrying the weight of legends and losses she couldn't begin to understand. Someone who'd chosen anonymity over glory, silence over celebration. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw a quiet plea. "Don't. Please, just don't." Olivia swallowed hard and nodded slightly. She wouldn't say anything. Not yet. But everything had changed in that single moment of recognition. The plane flew on through the darkening sky, carrying its passengers toward an unknown destination. And in seat 3C, Elias Turner closed his eyes again, unaware that his carefully constructed invisibility was beginning to crack, unaware that the past he'd tried so hard to outrun was about to catch up with him at 30,000 feet. The revelation of Elias's identity hung in the air between Olivia and the teenage boy across the aisle. Liam looked like he wanted to shout it from the overhead compartments, but something in Olivia's expression kept him quiet. She gave him a small shake of her head, a silent agreement to let the man beside her keep his anonymity, at least for now. Elias seemed unaware of the recognition spreading around him. He turned back to the window, watching the sky darken as they flew deeper into the night. Below them, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, invisible beneath thick cloud cover. The plane hummed steadily, the engine's rhythm almost hypnotic. Then, without warning, the cabin lights flickered. It was subtle at first, a brief dimming like someone had adjusted the brightness down and then back up. Most passengers didn't even notice, but Elias's posture changed immediately. His shoulders tensed, and his hand moved instinctively to the armrest, gripping it tightly. "Did you see that?" Olivia whispered. Before he could answer, the lights flickered again. This time, several passengers noticed. Concerned murmurs began spreading through the cabin. The entertainment screens went black for a moment, then rebooted with the airline's logo. Up in the cockpit, Captain Raymond Cole stared at his instrument panel with growing concern. The navigation display had developed a strange pattern, flickering between normal readings and distorted signals. His co-pilot, a younger man named Marcus Hayes, tapped the glass covering the instruments as if that might fix whatever was happening. "Are you seeing this?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with worry. "I'm seeing it." Cole's jaw clenched. He reached for the radio, adjusting frequencies to contact ground support. "This is Flight 447 requesting technical assistance. We're experiencing intermittent navigation system errors." Static filled the channel. Cole tried again, cycling through different frequencies. More static, occasionally broken by fragments of voices too distorted to understand. "Storm interference?" Marcus suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Cole didn't answer. He was staring at the backup instrumentation, watching the compass needle swing erratically. Whatever was happening, it was affecting multiple systems simultaneously. That didn't happen by accident. In the cabin, the seatbelt sign illuminated with a chime. Marisol's voice came through the speakers, carefully controlled, but with an edge of concern that trained ears could detect. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. There's no cause for alarm." But passengers were alarmed. Phones came out as people tried to text loved ones, only to find that the in-flight Wi-Fi had stopped working. The cabin lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging them into several seconds of darkness before the emergency lighting kicked in. Elias was on his feet before the main lights came back on. His entire demeanor had shifted. The exhausted, evasive man who'd been trying to disappear was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone whose eyes were scanning the cabin with tactical precision, noting every detail, every potential problem. Olivia watched him, fascinated and slightly frightened by the transformation. This was the man Liam had recognized. This was Elias Turner, the pilot. The intercom crackled to life, and Captain Cole's voice filled the cabin. He sounded calm, professional, but Olivia could hear the strain underneath. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Cole. We're experiencing some unexpected interference with our navigation systems. As a precautionary measure, I'm asking if there is anyone on board with advanced aviation experience. If so, please notify a flight attendant immediately." The cabin erupted in nervous chatter. Andrew Novak was on his feet instantly, waving his hand like a student desperate to be called on. "I have flight experience," he announced loudly. "Hundreds of hours. I can help." But no one was looking at him. Every eye in the immediate vicinity of row 3 had turned to Elias. Liam was practically vibrating with excitement. Even passengers who hadn't recognized him seemed to sense something about the way he stood there, perfectly balanced despite the plane's slight shaking, his gaze fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. Marisol appeared at his side, her expression respectful but urgent. "Sir, I think you should speak with the captain." "No." The word was flat, final. Elias sat back down, his jaw set. "I can't." "Sir, please." I said no. There was pain in his voice now, barely controlled. "I'm done with this. Find someone else." Olivia felt something twist in her chest. She'd seen his nightmare, heard him whisper about losing people. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had made him walk away from flying, it still had its claws in him deep. Liam leaned across the aisle, his young face earnest and pleading. "Mr. Turner, if you can help." "I can't." Elias didn't look at the boy. He stared straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs. The intercom crackled again. Captain Cole's voice was heavier now, the professional veneer cracking slightly. "This is a matter of safety. If anyone with aviation expertise is aboard, please come forward. We need your assistance." The cabin went quiet. Even Novak had stopped posturing, seeming to realize that whatever was happening was beyond his recreational helicopter hours. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Elias's breathing had quickened. His eyes were closed, and Olivia could see the rapid movement beneath his eyelids. He was somewhere else, lost in memory. His lips moved, forming silent words. Then she heard it, barely a whisper, I didn't bring everyone home. Understanding crashed over her. This wasn't about unwillingness. It was about fear, about trauma so deep it had driven him from the sky entirely. He wasn't refusing to help because he didn't care. He was refusing because last time he tried, people died. The turbulence increased sharply, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. A woman screamed. The overhead bins rattled ominously. And through it all, Elias sat frozen, trapped between past and present, unable to move forward or back. Olivia did something she hadn't expected to do. She reached over and placed her hand on his arm. His skin was cold despite the cabin's warmth. "If you can help," she whispered, quiet enough that only he could hear, "why won't you?" Elias's eyes opened. They were wet with unshed tears, haunted by ghosts she couldn't see. When he spoke, his voice was broken, raw with old grief. "Because last time, I didn't bring everyone home." The words hung between them, a confession and a wound. Olivia understood then what it cost him to even be on this plane, surrounded by people whose safety might depend on skills he'd buried with his past. The turbulence worsened. The plane shook violently enough that even the flight attendants, strapped into their jump seats, looked genuinely frightened. More warning lights must have illuminated in the cockpit because the seatbelt sign began flashing instead of just staying lit. Novak tried to stand again, stumbling toward the front of the plane. He made it 2 steps before a sudden drop in altitude sent him crashing into an armrest. He yelped in pain, his bravado completely shattered. Passengers could see through him now, see that his hours in recreational helicopters meant nothing in a situation like this. And slowly, desperately, hope began to shift toward Elias. "Please," Liam said, his voice cracking. "You're the only one who can help." Elias reached for his duffel bag with shaking hands. He pulled it onto his lap and unzipped it slowly, as if the simple motion required all his strength. Inside, nestled among worn clothes, was the teddy bear Olivia had glimpsed earlier. Its fur was matted, one button-eye missing, but it had been loved fiercely. Beneath it lay the wings, tarnished silver catching the emergency lighting. Elias lifted the bear carefully, cradling it like it was made of glass. His thumb traced the worn seam along its side, following the path of stitches that Maya's daughter had repaired herself, determined to keep her favorite toy whole. That little girl had lost her mother that day, and Elias had been the one to place this bear in her small hands at the memorial service, unable to speak past the guilt choking him. "I promised her I'd keep her safe," he whispered. "I promised." The plane shook again, harder. Somewhere in the back, luggage broke free from an overhead compartment and crashed into the aisle. The lights went out completely for 5 full seconds before flickering back to half strength. Elias placed the bear back into the bag with trembling hands, but he kept the wings. He held them in his palm, staring at them like they were both anchor and albatross. Then he closed his fingers around them, took a deep breath, and nodded to Marisol. "Take me to the captain." Olivia watched him stand, watched him transform once more. The weight was still there, the grief and fear, but underneath it was something stronger, something that had survived the crash that broke him. As Marisol led him toward the cockpit, passengers turned to watch. Some recognized him now, having overheard the name or seen Liam's photos. Others just sensed they were witnessing something significant. The scared, dismissive looks they'd given him during boarding were gone, replaced by desperate hope. Olivia sat in seat 3B, her heart pounding, and realized she was praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. Praying for the broken man who'd just walked away to find the strength to face his demons at 30,000 feet. Praying that this time, he could bring everyone home. The cockpit door opened, and Elias stepped through into a world he'd sworn never to enter again. The familiar layout hit him like a physical blow. The overhead panels with their switches and displays, the throttle controls, the seats where lives were held in balance. His hands started shaking again, and he shoved them into his pockets to hide it. Captain Raymond Cole turned in his seat, and the color drained from his face. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They just stared at each other across years of silence and guilt. "Turner," Cole's voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying the name any louder might shatter the fragile moment. I thought you were dead. Elias finished. Just dead inside. There's a difference. The co-pilot, Marcus, looked between them with confusion. You two know each other? We served together, Cole said, still staring at Elias. Long time ago. But it was more than that, and they both knew it. Cole had been Elias's commanding officer during the mission that ended everything. The mission where Elias's squadron had been sent into a combat zone to extract civilians trapped by enemy fire. The mission where everything went wrong. Flashbacks hit Elias in fragments, each one sharp as broken glass. The sound of rotors cutting through thick black smoke, the acrid smell of fuel and burning metal filling his nostrils even now, years later. Maya's voice over the radio, impossibly calm and professional even as tracer fire lit up the sky around her helicopter. She'd been calling out coordinates, trying to guide the extraction even as her own aircraft was dying beneath her. The moment her engine failed, that sound would haunt him forever. The change in pitch, the sudden lurch in her flight path that he'd seen through the smoke. The sickening spiral as she went down, her helicopter spinning like a falling leaf, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. His own voice screaming for her to hold on, to just hold on, while he fought desperately to keep his own bird steady enough to attempt a rescue. He tried. God, he tried. Pushed his aircraft to the absolute limit, ignored every warning light, every protocol, every instinct for self-preservation. But the ground fire had been too heavy, the smoke too thick. By the time he'd fought his way to where she'd gone down, Maya and her entire crew were gone. 5 people, 5 lives he'd been supposed to protect. The moment he realized he couldn't save her, couldn't save any of them, that moment had killed something fundamental inside him, something he wasn't sure had ever grown back. Focus on the present, Cole said sharply, recognizing the look on Elias's face. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror for months after that mission. We need you here. Now. Elias forced himself to breathe, to push the memories back into their locked boxes. He moved closer to the instrument panel, his trained eyes quickly scanning the displays. The navigation interference was worse than he'd expected, affecting not just GPS but multiple backup systems. Talk to me, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. What exactly are we dealing with? Marcus began explaining the sequence of failures, but Elias was already piecing it together from the instrument readings. The pattern was too specific, too targeted to be random malfunction or weather interference. This is radio frequency bleed-through, he said, interrupting Marcus mid-sentence. Something's broadcasting nearby, close enough to interfere with our systems. Cole's expression hardened. I was afraid you'd say that. Why? Elias turned to face him fully. What aren't you telling me? Cole hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elias saw the same trait that had always frustrated him about his former commander. The need to control information, to protect his own position even when transparency might save lives. We were rerouted, Cole admitted finally. Intelligence warned of unidentified aircraft in restricted airspace. I took an alternate route to avoid potential conflict, but I didn't want to alarm the passengers or crew with details. Elias felt anger surge through him, hot and immediate. You concealed a threat assessment? Are you insane? Concealment is how missions go wrong, how people die. I made a judgment call. A judgment call that's put everyone on this plane at risk. Elias's voice rose, months of buried resentment breaking free. This is exactly what you did before. Keeping information compartmentalized, thinking you knew better than everyone else. Cole's face flushed red. That mission was different. Was it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly the same. You making decisions that aren't yours alone to make and expecting everyone else to clean up the mess. Marcus looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. But Elias was past caring about professionalism or hierarchy. If he was going to risk his sanity to help, he needed the full truth. If I'm going to do this, he said, his voice dropping to something cold and controlled, I need complete transparency. Every detail, every bit of intelligence, everything, or I walk back to my seat and you figure this out yourself. Cole and Elias locked eyes, a battle of wills that stretched across years of unresolved conflict. Finally, Cole's shoulders sagged slightly. Fine, there's been chatter about unauthorized flights in this corridor. Possibly military, possibly private. Intelligence wasn't clear on origin or intent. I rerouted us to what I thought was a safer path, but clearly something followed us or was already waiting. Waiting suggests intent, Elias said. Do they know we're here? I don't know. Elias moved to the co-pilot's seat, his body remembering the position even as his mind screamed at him to run. Marcus vacated it quickly, moving to stand behind Cole. Elias's hands hovered over the controls, not quite touching, as if contact would seal some terrible bargain. I need full system access, he said. Cole hesitated only a second before entering the authorization codes. Elias's fingers flew across the touchscreens, bypassing faulty navigation systems and accessing manual controls that most modern pilots had never needed to use. His training came back like muscle memory, years of expertise rising through the fear. Back in the cabin, Olivia had asked Marisol about Elias, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. The flight attendant had hesitated, then shared what she knew, fragments of a story that newspapers had covered years ago before it disappeared from headlines. Elias Turner had been one of the most decorated pilots of his generation. Multiple commendations for valor, over a dozen successful rescue missions in hostile territory, a record of bringing people home against impossible odds. Until the mission that broke him. Until Maya Richards and her entire crew went down while Elias was forced to watch, unable to do anything but survive himself. He'd resigned immediately after, refused all medals, all recognition, disappeared so thoroughly that most people assumed he'd died or left the country. And here he was, on a commercial flight, being asked to face the very thing that had destroyed him. He must be terrified, Olivia said softly. Marisol nodded. The bravest people usually are. Meanwhile, in first class, Andrew Novak was secretly texting his PR team despite the Wi-Fi being down. The messages queued to send the moment connection was restored. He was already planning how to spin this crisis into publicity, how to position himself as the calm leader during chaos. His assistant Caroline watched him typing with disgust evident on her face. She took screenshots of his messages, adding them to the growing file she'd been compiling for months. Evidence of a man who saw every situation, even danger, as an opportunity for personal gain. She'd been waiting for the right moment to report him to the board, and she was beginning to think this might be it. Liam, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, but old enough to sense its importance, stared toward the cockpit where his hero had disappeared. He'd followed Elias Turner's career since he was 12, since the first time he'd read about a pilot who'd flown into enemy fire to save people he'd never met. Elias had been his inspiration to study aviation, to dream of a future in the sky. Seeing him broken and afraid had shattered something in Liam's hero worship. But watching him stand up despite that fear, walk toward the thing that terrified him most, that had rebuilt it into something more real, more human, more worthy of admiration. In the cockpit, Elias was manually recalibrating systems, his hand steady now that he had something to focus on. But then a new problem emerged on the displays. A proximity alert, faint but growing stronger. "We're not alone," he said quietly. Cole leaned forward, staring at the radar display. "That's impossible. We should be alone in this corridor." Should be and aren't the same thing. Elias's jaw tightened. "There's something out there, maybe 2 miles starboard and closing." Marcus pulled up the weather radar, trying to determine if it was just a storm formation. But the signature was wrong, too solid, too consistent. Elias recognized the pattern. He'd seen it hundreds of times during missions. "That's an aircraft. No doubt about it. Flying without transponder," Cole added grimly, deliberately avoiding identification. The interference on their systems spiked sharply, and several warning lights illuminated across the panel. Whatever was out there, it was actively broadcasting on frequencies that shouldn't be accessible to civilian or even most military aircraft. Elias's mind raced through possibilities. Smugglers, maybe running illegal routes. Military exercises gone wrong. Or something worse, something he didn't want to consider while responsible for hundreds of civilian lives. I need to try something, he said, reaching for the radio controls. What are you doing? Using old military frequency codes. If that's a decommissioned military aircraft, maybe I can make contact. Cole started to object, then stopped. They were out of good options and running low on time. He nodded. Elias adjusted frequencies to a channel that hadn't been used in combat operations since his active service days. He keyed the microphone, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Unidentified aircraft. This is civilian flight 447. We are experiencing navigation interference. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. Static filled the cockpit. Elias tried again, using specific codes that only military pilots would recognize. Codes that identified him as former combat aviation, someone who understood protocol. This time, the static broke. A voice emerged, garbled and distorted by interference, but unmistakably human. Turner? Is that... Thought you were gone. The voice cut out, replaced by static again. But those few words were enough to make Elias's blood run cold. Someone out there knew his name. Someone from his past was flying that aircraft. Did you hear that? He asked Cole, his voice tight. Cole nodded, his face pale. Someone from your squadron. I don't know. Maybe. Elias tried the radio again, but the interference had intensified. Whatever brief window had allowed that transmission through had closed. The mystery aircraft was still out there, matching their altitude and speed now. Not attacking, but not leaving either. Shadowing them through the night sky like a ghost from Elias's past, made manifest. His hands gripped the controls tighter. The wings he'd placed in his pocket pressed against his chest, a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he still stood to lose. What do we do? Marcus asked, looking to Cole and Elias like students waiting for teachers to provide answers. Elias stared out the cockpit window into the darkness, seeing nothing but clouds and his own reflection in the glass. Somewhere out, there was an aircraft carrying someone who knew him, someone who'd survived when so many others hadn't. And ahead of them, according to the weather radar that was still partially functional, was a storm system that made the turbulence they'd already experienced look like gentle breezes. We're running out of time, Cole said quietly. Fuel consumption is higher than projected because of the routing changes. We need to make a decision. Elias closed his eyes, and for just a moment, he let himself feel the full weight of it. The responsibility, the fear, the memories of last time when his best hadn't been good enough. Then he opened his eyes and began entering commands into the navigation computer. We follow it, he said. What? Cole leaned forward. We don't know who that is or what they want. No, Elias interruptive. But they know these skies, and they're trying to signal us. Look at the flight pattern. They're not threatening. They're guiding. He pulled up a tactical display, showing the shadow aircraft's movements overlaid on their own flight path. When seen together, a pattern emerged. The other aircraft was steering them away from something, banking gently whenever they got too close to a specific heading. They're warning us, Elias said with growing certainty, trying to keep us away from something worse than they are. Cole studied the display, and slowly his expression changed from skepticism to understanding. The storm. They're steering us around the worst of it. Or something in the storm. Elias's voice was grim. Either way, I think we need to trust them. It was a leap of faith, betting hundreds of lives on intuition and a few garbled words over radio. But Elias had spent his entire career learning to trust his instincts in situations where logic alone wasn't enough. Cole looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the broken man who'd resigned in disgrace, but the pilot who'd once been the best he'd ever served with. Finally, he nodded. Do it. Take us where they're leading. Elias's hands moved across the controls, making minute adjustments to their heading. The aircraft responded smoothly, banking gently to follow the shadow in the darkness. Behind him, Cole whispered, barely loud enough to hear, I'm sorry. For all of it. Elias didn't respond immediately. He was focused on flying, on the delicate dance of following an invisible partner through hostile skies. But after a moment, he said quietly, "We'll talk about it. If we survive this." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door, open just a crack. And as the plane cut through the night, following a ghost toward an unknown destination, both men held their breath and hoped that this one last time, everyone would make it home. With Elias now following the shadow aircraft guidance, the cockpit settled into tense concentration. The interference patterns continued to spike across the displays, but Elias had developed a rhythm with the manual controls, compensating for the erratic readings with the kind of instinctive precision that only came from thousands of hours in the air. Running full diagnostics, Elias said, his fingers moving across the touchscreen with practiced efficiency. The results confirmed what he'd suspected. The interference source wasn't stationary. It was moving parallel to their flight path, maintaining a consistent distance. This isn't weather interference. It's too precise, too controlled. Cole leaned over to study the data, his expression darkening. "You're saying someone's actively jamming our systems?" "Not jamming. More like bleeding through." Elias pulled up a frequency analysis that showed overlapping signal patterns. "It's like they're broadcasting so strongly on military frequencies that it's overwhelming our civilian systems. Either they don't know we're here, or they don't care." Marcus, standing behind them, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if they're military, shouldn't we contact?" "Contact who?" Cole interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "We've been trying to reach ground control for 20 minutes. Whatever's out there is blocking everything." Elias noticed the defensiveness in Cole's tone, the way his former commander's shoulders had tensed. There was something else happening here, something Cole still wasn't sharing. The old familiar pattern of information control that had driven Elias crazy during their service together. "Raymond." Elias used his first name deliberately, stripping away rank and protocol. "I need to know everything. Not your filtered version. Everything." The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the cockpit felt smaller, the air heavier. Cole's jaw worked as he fought some internal battle between pride and pragmatism. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and reluctant. "When intelligence warned about unauthorized aircraft in this corridor, they weren't just talking about routine violations. There's been increased activity in this region. Unidentified flights running routes that suggest deliberate pattern. Military analysts think it might be covert operations, possibly private military contractors operating outside normal channels. And you flew us into the middle of it anyway." Elias's voice was dangerously quiet. "I thought the reroute would keep us clear. The alternate path was supposed to be nowhere near the hot zone." Cole's composure cracked, showing the fear underneath. "I made a judgment call to avoid alarming passengers about a threat that intelligence said was low probability." "Low probability isn't no probability." Elias turned back to the controls, forcing himself to focus on the immediate problem rather than his anger. "And now we're here flying blind, following an unidentified aircraft because we're out of better options." Before Cole could respond, Elias had an idea. "Maris Saul," he said into the intercom, "please bring Liam Bradford to the cockpit." The teenager? Cole looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Why?" "Because he's been tracking aviation frequencies as a hobby for years. If anyone on this plane can help us pinpoint that interference source, it's him." Cole started to object, then stopped. They were beyond protocol now, beyond normal procedures. If a teenage aviation enthusiast could help, they needed to use every resource available. 3 minutes later, Liam appeared in the cockpit doorway, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. He clutched his phone like a lifeline, and Elias could see his hands shaking. "Mr. Turner?" His voice cracked on the name. "Show me what you've got," Elias said, gesturing him forward. "You've been monitoring frequencies, right?" Liam nodded rapidly, pulling up his aviation tracking app. "I've been logging unusual signals for the past hour. Started right after we hit cruising altitude." He handed the phone to Elias with trembling hands. "I didn't know if it meant anything, but I saved all the data." Elias studied the screen, and his expression shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. The kid had been thorough, documenting frequency spikes, duration patterns, even cross-referencing them with known military channels. It was amateur work, but it was good amateur work. "This is helpful," Elias said, and Liam's face lit up like he'd just been handed a medal. "Can you keep monitoring? Let me know immediately if the pattern changes." "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." As Liam stationed himself by the navigation console, practically vibrating with purpose, Elias returned his attention to the larger problem. He began overlaying Liam's frequency data with the aircraft tracking, looking for correlations. Back in the cabin, Olivia had been piecing together what she could from whispered conversations with Marisol and other passengers. The realization of who Elias Turner actually was had spread through the economy section like wildfire, passed in hushed tones and shared phone screens showing archived news articles. She'd read the stories now. The decorated combat pilot who'd flown dozens of rescue missions. The man who'd been nominated for the highest military honors. And then the mission that ended it all. The one where 5 crew members died while Elias watched helplessly, unable to reach them through enemy fire and mechanical failure. The articles said he'd resigned immediately after, refusing all recognition, all attempts at consolation. Some reporters speculated he'd had a breakdown. Others suggested guilt had driven him into seclusion. But they all agreed on one thing. Elias Turner had been one of the best pilots of his generation, and his loss had been felt deeply in the aviation community. Now that man was in the cockpit, facing the thing that had broken him, trying to save a plane full of strangers. Olivia felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of courage that had nothing to do with fearlessness and everything to do with acting despite being terrified. She looked around the cabin at the other passengers, people scrolling anxiously through their phones, parents holding children close, the elderly couple across the aisle clutching hands. All of them depending on a man who'd sworn never to fly again. And then she saw Andrew Novak. The tech CEO was in his seat, but his fingers were moving rapidly across his phone screen. Even without Wi-Fi, he was composing messages, staging what looked like a crisis response plan. Caroline sat beside him, her own phone out, but she was watching him with an expression Olivia recognized, the look of someone gathering evidence. Olivia made a decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way to first class, ignoring the turbulence warning lights. She slid into the empty seat across from Caroline. "You're building a case against him, aren't you?" Olivia kept her voice low. Caroline's eyes widened, then narrowed with assessment. After a moment, she nodded. "He's been exploiting every crisis for the past 3 years, turning tragedies into PR opportunities, manipulating situations for personal gain. I've been documenting it all. What's he doing now?" Caroline angled her screen so Olivia could see. Novak's drafted messages were exactly what she'd suspected. Plans to position himself as a calming influence during the crisis, to claim he'd offered aviation expertise, to spin the entire situation into a story where he was the hero. "He's disgusting," Olivia said flatly. "He's a narcissist with a platform." Caroline's voice was tired, defeated. "And unless someone stops him, he'll keep doing this. Keep using other people's suffering to build his brand." Olivia thought about her own career, about the carefully curated posts and strategic partnerships, about how much of her life had become performance rather than reality, about the message from her fiancé that still sat unanswered on her phone, demanding she maintain appearances even in the middle of a crisis. "If you need a witness when you report him," Olivia said, "I'll back you up." Caroline looked at her with surprise, then something like hope. "You do that? You don't even know me. I know enough." Olivia glanced back toward economy, toward seat 3C where Elias had been sitting. "I've been watching someone actually brave tonight. I think it's time I tried being brave, too." The plane shuddered through another bout of turbulence, but Olivia barely noticed. She was too focused on the realization that she'd been living a performance for so long, she'd almost forgotten what authenticity looked like. Until tonight. Until a broken man showed her what real courage meant. In the cockpit, Elias and Cole had been coordinating with Liam's frequency data, and they'd made a discovery. The Shadow aircraft wasn't just flying parallel to them. It was actively adjusting course to steer them away from something specific. Every time their flight path drifted toward a particular heading, the interference intensified and the shadow aircraft would bank gently, like a shepherd guiding sheep away from danger. "They're protecting us," Elias said, the certainty growing in his voice. "Whoever's flying that aircraft, they're trying to help. Or lead us into a trap," Cole countered, though his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. "If they wanted to harm us, they'd had plenty of opportunities." Elias gestured at the tactical display. "They could have forced us into the worst of the storm, or worse. Instead, they're flying escort, keeping us on a safe vector." Liam suddenly spoke up, his voice excited. "Mr. Turner, the frequency pattern just changed. It's weaker now, like they're deliberately reducing broadcast strength." Elias immediately checked the navigation systems. Several displays that had been flickering erratically were starting to stabilize. Not fully functional, but better. Much better. "They heard us," he said, wonder creeping into his voice. "Why use those old military codes? They recognize them. They're adjusting their systems to reduce interference with ours." Cole leaned forward, studying the improvements. "If they can do that, they must have significant technical capability. This isn't some amateur operation." Elias tried the radio again, this time using a different set of codes. Ones that had been specific to rescue operations, to identifying friendly forces in hostile territory. He keyed the microphone, his heart pounding. "Shadow Flight, this is Turner. If you can hear me, adjust heading 2 degrees starboard if you're friendly." For long seconds, nothing happened. Then, smoothly, the contact on their radar shifted exactly 2 degrees to the right. "Dear God," Marcus breathed. "They're talking to us." Elias felt something break open in his chest, a possibility he'd been afraid to consider. "Ask them about Maya," he said to the radio, his voice rough. "Use her call sign. Ask if anyone from her squad survived." Cole looked at him with understanding and pity. They both knew the official reports. Maya Richards and her entire crew had been listed as killed in action. But Elias had never stopped hoping, never stopped wondering if maybe, somehow, someone had made it out. He transmitted again, using Maya's old call sign and squadron designation, then waited, barely breathing, for response. The radio crackled. Through heavy static, that voice came again, clearer now. "Turner, Maya kept your wings. She said you'd fly again." Elias's hand started shaking so badly he had to grip the control yoke to steady them. "Maya kept your wings. Past tense. She was gone, had been gone, just like the report said. But someone who'd known her, who'd been with her, had survived." "Who is this?" he transmitted, his voice breaking. "Identify yourself." "Jackson, Maya's co-pilot. I pulled out before the end. Couldn't save her. Couldn't save anyone else. Been flying these routes ever since, watching for anything I could still protect." Tears were streaming down Elias's face now, and he didn't care who saw them. Marcus looked away, giving him privacy. Cole had his hand over his mouth, his own eyes wet. Jackson had been Maya's second-in-command, a young pilot fresh out of training. Elias remembered him as eager, talented, terrified of disappointing anyone. The official reports had listed him with the others, killed in action. But he'd survived. He'd been out here alone, flying shadow missions like some kind of guardian angel. "Jackson, can you guide us to safe landing? Our navigation is compromised, fuel's running low." A pause, then, "There's a naval airbase 70 miles northeast. I can get you there, but you'll need to fly manual approach. No instrument support." "I can do it." Elias's voice was stronger now, steadier. "Just get us there. Following me in. Stay tight on my wing." The shadow aircraft began a slow bank, and Elias matched it perfectly, his hands moving across controls with the muscle memory of thousands of flight hours. The fear was still there, the trauma, the weight of memory. But beneath it was something else now. Purpose, connection, a chance to finally bring everyone home. Cole watched him fly, seeing the transformation. This was the Elias Turner he'd known before the tragedy. The pilot who could make an aircraft dance through impossible situations. The man he'd been forced to ground, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because grief had made him a danger to himself. "I should have fought harder for you," Cole said quietly. "After the mission, I should have stood by you instead of just processing paperwork and moving on. Elias didn't take his eyes off the shadow aircraft, but his jaw tightened. We'll talk about it after we land. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. It was a beginning. The plane burst through a thick cloud bank, and suddenly the shadow aircraft was visible. It materialized off their starboard wing, close enough that they could make out details. The aircraft was large, military in design, but with modifications that spoke of years operating off the grid. Its gray paint was weathered, unmarked. "There you are," Elias murmured. Inside that aircraft was Jackson, who'd watched Maya die, who'd lived with the same guilt that had crushed Elias, who'd spent years flying alone, trying to atone for survival. Cole's voice was hushed with something like awe. "I thought it was just intelligence chatter. I thought the reports were exaggerated." "They usually aren't," Elias said, his eyes never leaving the shadow aircraft. "They're usually worse than reported." Liam was pressed against the cockpit window, his phone forgotten in his excitement. "Mr. Turner, do you see the modifications? Those aren't standard military configurations. Someone's been customizing that bird for years." "Long-range operations," Elias confirmed, noting the extended fuel pods and upgraded communications array. "Built for endurance, not speed." "Jackson's been flying patrols out here, watching these corridors." "Watching for what?" Marcus asked. Before anyone could answer, Elias's radio crackled again. Jackson's voice came through, clearer now, with reduced interference. "Turner, you need to understand what you're flying into. There's a reason I've been running these patrols. This airspace is not just about unauthorized flights. There's something else out here." "What kind of something?" Elias kept his voice calm, but his grip on the controls tightened. "Weather anomaly ahead. It's been building for hours. Massive supercell formation, winds exceeding anything your aircraft is rated for. I've been trying to vector commercial flights around it, but your reroute put you on a collision course." Cole's face went pale. "He's been protecting commercial flights? For how long?" 3 years. Jackson's voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Since I couldn't save my own crew, I've been saving everyone else's." The weight of that statement settled over the cockpit. 3 years of solitary missions, flying an aircraft that wasn't supposed to exist, protecting people who'd never know he was there. It was penance and purpose twisted together. Elias transmitted back, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you, Jackson, for all of it. Don't thank me yet. Getting you through this storm is going to take everything we've both got." As if on cue, the turbulence intensified dramatically. The plane shook hard enough to rattle teeth, and warning alarms began sounding across the panel. The storm Jackson had mentioned was visible now, a massive wall of darkness ahead of them, lit from within by constant lightning. In the cabin, the sudden violence of the turbulence sent panic rippling through the passengers. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments, swinging wildly. A child started screaming. Adults followed suit, their fear finally breaking through the thin veneer of control. Olivia had made it back to her seat in economy, and she found herself gripping the armrests as the plane bucked and shuddered. Around her, people were crying, praying, some making desperate phone calls to loved ones even though there was no signal. She thought about the breathing technique Elias had taught her, thought about his steady voice, his calm in the face of terror, and she made a decision. "Hey." She raised her voice to be heard over the chaos. "Everyone, listen to me." Faces turned toward her, tears streaked and terrified. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But there's someone in that cockpit right now who knows what he's doing. Someone who's faced worse than this and survived." She forced her voice to stay steady, channeling the calm Elias had shown her. "We're going to get through this, but I need you to breathe with me." She started counting, demonstrating the breathing pattern Elias had used. In for 4. Hold for 2. Out for 6. Slowly, miraculously, people began to follow her lead. The panic didn't disappear, but became manageable, controlled. Parents used the technique with their children. Strangers held hands and breathed together. Marisol, moving through the cabin, checking on passengers, stopped when she saw what Olivia was doing. Their eyes met, and the flight attendant nodded with respect. This was leadership born from genuine care, not performance. This was real. But Andrew Novak, still in first class, saw only an opportunity. He began recording Olivia's efforts on his phone, already planning how to frame it. A story about his company's brand ambassador showing courage during crisis, of course omitting the fact that Olivia had never worked for him and was doing this entirely on her own. Caroline saw him recording and felt something snap inside her. She'd been patient for 3 years, collecting evidence, building her case. But watching him exploit even this moment, even Olivia's genuine attempt to help people, was too much. She stood up, walked over to Novak, and held out her hand. "Give me the phone." "Excuse me?" "The phone. Now, or I'm going to the board with everything I have." Novak stared at her, fear flickering in his eyes. His assistant had been watching, documenting, waiting. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice shook. "Delete that video. Stop exploiting this situation, or I expose everything." Novak's fingers trembled as he deleted the video. Caroline returned to her seat, heart pounding but feeling lighter than she had in years. Olivia had seen the confrontation from her position in economy. She caught Caroline's eye and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Caroline nodded back, and something like friendship was born between 2 women who'd chosen courage in the same moment. In the cockpit, Elias was fighting the storm with everything he had. Jackson's aircraft was ahead and slightly above, cutting through the turbulence with the kind of precision that came from years of solo operations. Elias matched his every move, following the shadow aircraft through gaps in the weather that he never would have found on his own. "Fuel warning," Marcus called out, his voice tight. "We're at critical levels." "How long?" Elias didn't take his eyes off Jackson's aircraft. 15 minutes, maybe 20 if we're lucky." "Jackson, what's our ETA to the naval base?" 18 minutes if we maintain current speed. But we'll have to drop below the storm layers soon, and the crosswinds there are brutal. We'll manage." Elias's hands were steady now, all fear burned away by the need to focus. This was what he'd been trained for, impossible situations requiring perfect execution. "Call out the descent when you're ready." "Negative, Turner. You take the lead on this one." "What? What?" Jackson's voice was quiet but firm. "Because I'm flying on fumes too. Been running patrols too long, pushed my fuel too far. I've got enough to get you down, but not enough to land myself." The implications hit Elias like a punch. "Jackson, no. It's okay, brother. This is what I've been out here for. To save the ones I couldn't save before. Let me do this. Let me in it the right way." Cole grabbed the radio. "Negative. We can coordinate dual landing. We can—" "No time for arguments, Captain." Jackson's aircraft began descending, leading them toward the break in the storm. "Turner, you've got the approach. Trust your instincts. Fly it like you used to." Elias wanted to scream, to refuse, to find some way to save Jackson like he couldn't save Maya. But the fuel warning was blaring, the storm was closing in, and hundreds of lives depended on him making the right choice. He followed Jackson down through the storm layer, into turbulence so violent it felt like the aircraft might shake apart. Lightning flashed continuously, turning the world into stuttering photographs. Rain hammered the windscreen, so hard visibility dropped to almost nothing. But Jackson's aircraft stayed visible ahead of them, a beacon in the chaos, leading them through with the kind of flying that came from being more at home in the sky than on the ground. Approaching final descent corridor, Jackson transmitted. "Naval base is 10 miles ahead. You're clear for approach." "Jackson, you need to land first. No fuel for go-around if I mess it up. You land clean, I'll put down after." "That's an order, Turner." It wasn't really an order. Jackson had no authority over him. But Elias heard what it really was, a plea. A brother pilot asking for the grace of dying to save others, of ending years of guilt with one final act of protection. "Copy," Elias said, his voice thick. "See you on the ground, Jackson. See you on the ground." Through the storm, lights appeared, the naval airbase, its runways lit like jewels against the darkness. Elias lined up for approach, his hands moving with automatic precision, even as his mind screamed at the unfairness of it all. Jackson's aircraft pulled up and away, giving them clear approach. Elias could see it climbing back into the storm, fighting for altitude with engines that were running on vapor. Landing gear down, Cole said, his voice mechanical as he went through the checklist. Gear down locked, Marcus confirmed. Elias focused on the runway, on the approach that required perfect execution with no room for error. Manual flying, no computer assistance, crosswinds trying to push them off course with every meter of descent. He thought about Maya, about the crew he couldn't save, about Jackson, somewhere above them, flying on borrowed time, about Olivia and Liam and all the passengers who'd placed their lives in his hands. "We're committed," he said quietly. The runway rushed up to meet them. Elias made constant minute corrections, fighting the wind, the rain, the screaming protest of an aircraft pushed beyond its limits. Wills touched down. The impact was hard, spine shaking, sending shudders through the entire fuselage. Oxygen masks swayed violently. Passengers screamed. The aircraft skidded, hydroplaning on the rain-slicked runway, sparks flying where metal scraped against concrete. But Elias held it steady, applied reverse thrust, fought the skid, kept them centered on the runway, even as they slid hundreds of feet before finally, impossibly, coming to a stop. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The cabin was silent except for the rain hammering against the metal skin and the dying whine of engines spooling down. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the entire cabin erupted in applause, in tears, in prayers of gratitude. They were down. They were safe. They were alive. But Elias wasn't celebrating. He was staring up through the cockpit window into the storm, searching for any sign of Jackson's aircraft, praying for a miracle he knew wasn't coming. Cole's hand landed on his shoulder, heavy with shared grief and understanding. "He saved us," Cole said quietly. "Let him have that." Elias closed his eyes, feeling tears he'd held back for years finally break free. They were down. They were safe. But not everyone had made it home. Not this time either. The emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within minutes, their lights painting the rain-soaked tarmac in streaks of color. Firefighters stood ready with foam cannons. Paramedics waited by ambulances, prepared for casualties that, miraculously, hadn't materialized. Inside the cabin, passengers sat in stunned silence. Some were crying. Others stared at nothing. The applause had faded, replaced by the heavy quiet of people confronting their own mortality. Elias remained in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the controls though the aircraft was no longer moving. His entire body trembled with adrenaline crash, years of suppressed fear finally breaking through the dam he'd built around it. "You did it," Cole said quietly from beside him. "You brought them home. Not everyone." Elias's voice was hollow. His eyes were fixed on the storm above, searching for any sign of Jackson's aircraft. But there was nothing. Just darkness and rain and the terrible certainty that Jackson had given everything to guide them down. Marcus had left the cockpit to coordinate with ground personnel, leaving Elias and Cole alone with their ghosts. The silence stretched between them, weighted with years of unspoken words and unresolved guilt. Finally, Cole spoke. "I need to say this. I've needed to say it for 3 years." He took a shaky breath. "Grounding you after Maya's mission was the worst decision I ever made. Not because it was wrong procedurally, but because I did it to protect myself. I was the commanding officer. The mission parameters, the intelligence, the go order, all of that came from me. When it went wrong, when we lost them, I should have taken responsibility. Instead, I let you carry it alone." Elias turned to look at him, seeing tears on his former commander's face. "You were the best pilot I ever served with," Cole continued, his voice breaking. "And I destroyed you because I was too much of a coward to face my own failures. I am sorry, yes. I'm so goddamn sorry." The apology hung in the air between them. Elias felt something inside him crack, something he kept frozen and hardened for so long. Anger, yes, but underneath it was grief they'd both been carrying. Grief for Maya, for her crew, for the friendship he and Cole had shared before everything fell apart. "You did break me," Elias said quietly. "But I let you. I'll let the guilt consume me instead of fighting back." I walked away from everything because it was easier than facing what happened. He met Cole's eyes. We both failed them. We both failed each other. And we've both been punishing ourselves ever since. So where do we go from here? Elias thought about Jackson, somewhere in that storm, choosing to end his own 3-year penance by saving strangers. About the teddy bear in his duffel bag, the weight he'd been carrying. About Liam's face in the cockpit, full of hope and admiration. We stopped carrying it alone, Elias said. We remember them by living, by flying again if we can, by being the people they believed we were. Cole extended his hand, and this time when they shook, it wasn't the stiff, uncomfortable gesture from the cabin walk-through. It was real. 2 broken men finding their way towards something like forgiveness. The cockpit door opened, and Liam burst through, his face streaked with tears and rain from the open passenger door. "Mr. Turner, you have to come see this." Elias and Cole followed him back into the cabin, where passengers were crowding around the windows on one side of the aircraft. Olivia was there too, her face pressed against the glass, and when she saw Elias, she grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "Look," she said, pointing into the sky, through the rain and darkness. Descending slowly on what had to be the last drops of fuel in its tanks was Jackson's aircraft. It was coming in at an angle that made Elias's heart stop. Too steep, too fast, the approach of a pilot who knew this was a one-way landing. "He made it," Liam breathed. "He's going to make it." They watched in silence as Jackson fought the crosswinds, battling to line up with the runway. The aircraft wobbled, overcorrected, wobbled again. But Jackson held it together through sheer force of will, bringing the massive bird down toward the rain-slicked concrete. The wheels touched. The aircraft bounced once, hard, then settled. It rolled down the runway, slower and slower, until it finally stopped about 200 yards from where Elias's plane sat. The cabin erupted in cheers. Passengers who didn't even know what they were celebrating joined in, caught up in the moment. Elias felt Olivia's hand squeeze his arm, felt Cole's hand land on his shoulder, and for the first time in 3 years, he let himself feel something other than grief. Hope. Small and fragile, but real. "I need to see him," Elias said. He made his way down the aisle toward the exit, and as he passed, passengers reached out to touch his arm, to thank him, to express gratitude they couldn't put into words. He nodded to each of them, but his focus was on getting outside, on reaching Jackson before the moment slipped away. The rain hit him when he stepped onto the stairs. It was cold and hard, soaking through his t-shirt in seconds. But he didn't care. He ran across the tarmac, toward Jackson's aircraft, shoes splashing through puddles. Emergency personnel tried to stop him, but Cole was right behind him, flashing credentials. "Let him through. That's his brother up there." Jackson's aircraft door was opening as Elias reached it. A figure appeared in the opening, backlit by the interior lights. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the gap between aircraft and ground. Then Jackson climbed down, moving like someone who'd been sitting in a cockpit for too many hours, and when his feet hit the tarmac, Elias was there. They grabbed each other in an embrace that was more collision than hug, both men shaking, both crying openly. 3 years of separate guilt, separate missions, separate survival, crashing together in the rain. "I thought you were dead," Elias said into Jackson's shoulder. "The reports said everyone. I pulled out at the last second. Saw the missiles coming, had maybe 3 seconds to react. I've been living with that ever since. 3 seconds that saved me and damned me. You saved us tonight. Saved hundreds of people." Jackson pulled back, his young face aged beyond its years. "Doesn't bring Maya back." "No," Elias agreed. "But it matters. What you've been doing, it matters." Behind them, passengers were being evacuated. Olivia emerged into the rain, her designer clothes ruined, and she didn't care. When she reached Elias, she didn't know what to say. All the words she'd prepared felt inadequate. So instead, she just stood beside him, offering silent support. Cole approached Jackson, and the younger pilot's posture shifted, becoming military formal despite the informal circumstances. "At ease, Lieutenant," Cole said quietly. "You've been flying unauthorized missions for 3 years. I should probably arrest you." "Yes, sir, but I'm not going to." Because what you did tonight, what you've been doing, it's what Maya would have wanted. Protecting people. Saving lives. Cole's voice grew thick. She'd be proud of you. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you too. Jackson's composure finally broke. He nodded, unable to speak. Liam had followed Olivia out into the rain, and now he stood at the edge of the group, uncertain whether he belonged. Elias saw him and beckoned him forward. Liam, this is Jackson. Jackson, this is the kid who helped us find you. Jackson looked at Liam, taking in the teenager's awestruck expression, the aviation tracking app still clutched in his hand. You want to fly someday? More than anything, Liam said. Then learn from this. Jackson gestured to Elias, to Cole, to the aircraft behind them. Learn that flying isn't just about the technical skills. It's about the people you carry, the responsibility, the weight of lives in your hands. And learn that when you fall, when you fail, you can still find your way back. If you're brave enough to try. Elias looked at Liam, then really looked at him, and saw himself 20 years ago. Young, eager, full of dreams about the sky. If you're serious about learning, he said slowly, I might know someone who could teach you. You? Liam's voice cracked with hope. Maybe, if I can remember how to do it without the nightmares. Elias glanced at Jackson. Both of us. We could teach you the right way, the way Maya would have taught you. Jackson nodded, something like purpose flickering in his exhausted eyes. One student at a time, one flight at a time, until it doesn't hurt so much to remember. Every pilot needs a reason to keep flying, Elias said. And this time when he said it, he believed it. The Naval Base Medical Facility cleared all passengers within 2 hours. Minor injuries, nothing serious. It was doctors kept saying miraculous. Olivia sat in the waiting area, her phone connected to Wi-Fi, messages pouring in. She ignored them all. Instead, she waited for Elias. When he emerged from the examination room, he looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if landing that plane had released pressure he'd been holding for years. He saw her and stopped, surprised. You're still here. I wanted to thank you properly. Before all the noise starts. She gestured at her phone. The media's already picking up the story. Passenger footage, tracking data, everything. By morning, everyone's going to know what happened tonight. Elias's expression clouded. I know, but it's going to happen anyway. Olivia stood, meeting his eyes. I'm a social media strategist. Or I was. I'm not sure anymore what I want to be. She took a breath. But I know I don't want to go back to performing for strangers. I want to tell real stories. Important stories. Stories about people like you. I'm not a story. You are, though, and you get to decide how it's told. She pulled out her phone. I'd like permission to share what happened tonight. Not the sensational version. Not the hero worship version. The real version. About a man who was broken and found the courage to try again. About loss and grief and the hard work of healing. Elias was quiet for a long moment. What would you call it? The truth. That you fell. That you got back up. That courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about flying anyway. He thought about Maya, about the teddy bear still in his duffel, about everything he'd been running from. Then he thought about Liam's face in the cockpit, about Jackson landing in the rain, about second chances being rare and precious. Okay, he said, but on one condition. Don't make it about the fall. Make it about learning to fly again. Olivia nodded, tears in her eyes. I can do that. Across the facility, Caroline was on the phone with Novak's board of directors, her evidence finally being heard. Novak sat in a separate room, his phone confiscated, his empire crumbling as the truth came out. When Caroline hung up, she felt years of weight lift. She'd done the right thing. She found Olivia in the waiting area and sat down beside her. They're removing him from the company, launching a full investigation. I'm going to testify. Good, Olivia said simply. You were brave. So were you. In the cabin, with the breathing exercises. You saved people from panic. I learned it from him. Olivia nodded toward Elias, who was talking with Cole and Jackson near the windows. Turns out real courage is contagious. Outside, a naval officer approached the 3 pilots. The Shadow aircraft was technically military property Jackson had been flying illegally, but given the circumstances, the Navy was willing to overlook it. We're offering you a position, the officer said to Jackson. Official search and rescue. Legal flights. Same mission, but with support and a paycheck. Jackson looked at Elias, uncertain. What do you think? I think Maya would tell you to stop punishing yourself and start living again. Take the job. Save people legally. Maybe that's how we honor them. Jackson accepted with a handshake, and for the first time in 3 years, his smile reached his eyes. Cole had been cleared to return to commercial aviation, though he decided to take some time first. I need to talk to some people, he'd said. Maya's family. The families of her crew. I need to apologize for not being there for them. For hiding behind protocol instead of being human. That's going to be hard, Elias warned. Good. It should be. The 3 men walked toward the hangar where Jackson's aircraft was being stored. Rain still fell, lighter now, and somewhere above the clouds. Dawn was breaking even if they couldn't see it yet. Elias carried his duffel bag, the teddy bear inside heavier with memory than with physical weight. When they reached the aircraft, he climbed up to the cockpit alone, Cole and Jackson giving him space. The interior smelled of fuel and metal. Elias pulled out the teddy bear and placed it carefully in the pilot's seat. It's one button. I seem to watch him. I'm going to try, he whispered to Maya's memory. I'm going to fly again. I'm going to teach Liam. But I need you to let me heal. Can you do that? The bear said nothing, but Elias felt something shift inside him anyway. Permission, or just acceptance. He left the bear there, in the cockpit of the aircraft that had saved them. A memorial and a release, both at once. When he climbed back down, Liam was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, having followed them from the medical facility. So, Liam asked, his voice trying for casual and failing. Did you mean it? About teaching me? I meant it. Elias put his hand on the teenager's shoulder. But it's not going to be easy. Flying isn't a game. It's responsibility and weight and sometimes impossible choices. You sure you want that? I've never been more sure of anything. Elias looked at Jackson, who nodded. Looked at Cole, who smiled. Then we start next week. Ground school first. Theory before practice. And you have to promise me something. Anything. When you fly for the right reasons. Not glory, not ego. You fly to protect people. To bring them home safe. The way Maya flew. The way we should all fly. Liam nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of what he was being offered. Not just flight training, but a legacy. A way of being in the sky that honored the fallen by serving the living. Olivia emerged from the hangar office, her phone in her hand, but for once not looking at it. The airline's sending buses to take everyone to hotels. They're rescheduling flights for tomorrow. You going back? Elias asked. She thought about her fiancé's messages, still unread. About the sponsorship meeting, the performance, the life she'd built on appearances rather than authenticity. I don't know. Maybe not to the same place I left. Change is hard. So, is staying the same when you've seen what matters? She looked at him directly. I judged you when you got on the plane. I saw your worn t-shirt and your old bag, and I made assumptions about who you were. I'm sorry for that. You weren't wrong to judge me. I was broken. No, Olivia said firmly. You were healing. There's a difference. And watching you tonight, watching you face your fear and fly anyway, that changed something in me. I want to be that kind of brave. The real kind, not the performance kind. Elias smiled, and it transformed his face. Then be brave. Tell your real stories. Live your real life. Choose the hard, authentic path instead of the easy, curated one. Is that what you're going to do? I'm going to try. The buses arrived then, pulling up to the hangar with their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Passengers filed out of the medical facility, moving slower than they had during boarding, more thoughtful. They'd all been changed by the night, whether they fully understood it yet or not. As people began climbing onto the buses, Elias stood with Jackson and Cole and Liam, watching the sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind clean air and the promise of sunrise. So, Jackson said quietly, where do we go from here? Elias thought about the question, thought about the past 3 years of running, of hiding, of letting fear keep him grounded. Thought about Maya and her crew, about the weight of memory and the possibility of healing. Thought about Liam beside him, young and eager and full of the same dreams Elias had once carried. He looked up at the clearing sky, and for the first time in years, felt the pull of it. Not the terror, not the grief, but the old joy. The love of flight that had brought him to aviation in the first place, before the missions and the medals and the losses. Up, he said simply. Always up. The sun broke through the clouds then, spilling golden light across the tarmac, across the aircraft, across the faces of 4 pilots standing together. For men who'd fallen in different ways, who'd carried their failures and their grief through years of darkness. But the night was ending, and ahead of them, the sky waited, vast and forgiving and full of possibility. Elias Turner had been asleep in seat 3C when this journey began, a man running from his past, from his pain, from himself. He was awake now, finally awake, and ready at last to fly home. When the weight of your past becomes unbearable, do you keep running, or do you finally turn around and face what broke you? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about courage, redemption, and second chances.